Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the August 2021 Summer Market Performance Report. The report can be found out on the Reports Bulletins page under the Market and Operations tab on the ISO website, and it can also be found out on the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meetings webpage as well. And on that same Miscellaneous Stakeholder page, you'll also be able to find the presentation that we'll be showing today. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. Guillermo Bautista Alderte, the Director of Market Analysis and Forecasting, is going to provide overview of the report, and he's also joined by a few other members of his team, including Zhu Long, Amber Motley, Abhishek Hundwali, and Michael Stewart. We are recording today's call and we'll post the video file on the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meetings webpage for a limited time. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will be pausing to take questions today throughout the presentation, and you can either raise your hand or you can also send your question in a chat to myself, or you can send it to all panelists. Again, my name is Isabella Nicosia. If you do want to raise your hand to ask a verbal question and you use the Call Me feature on WebEx, then you'll need to press the raise hand icon, which is located right above the chat window. If you dialed in separately to the web conference, you'll need to press #2 to enter the queue, and we will remind you of those instructions when it's time for questions. But with that, I will hand it over to Guillermo, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Isabella. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time for this call. I expect that this call is going to be shorter than the previous ones, given how things play for August. And as a reference, we have been posting and assessing the performance of the summer conditions for the summer months. We started with June. We are so far going through August, and there's still one more to come. That will be for September. And many of our efforts, including the posting of certain information that we do on a daily basis, are going to wind down once we cross September. And I would encourage you to continue participating in the initiatives that are on their way regarding the forward scheduling, because many of these components had to do with the transparency and with items that are pertinent to the summer conditions. Next slide, please. As you may recall, we have a series of enhancements that were deployed throughout the summer. The last component of the summer enhancements was actually implemented on August 4th. And August 4th is kind of relative because all the system changes took effect on August 4th. But depending on what market you are looking at, it may be one day after or even 2 days after. For instance, you're looking at the results of August 16, the day-ahead market. Those changes became effective starting with trading date August 6th. If you are looking something more in the real time, you may start to see these changes as early as the same afternoon of August 4th. For practical purposes, we are referring to August 4th. That is when we effectively deploy all the functionality into the systems. And each market is just going to catch up as when the market is run. And here you have the list of all the main components of the summer enhancements. And some of them are in place all the time. Some of them trigger based on specific events. And in general, several of these features were not activated or triggered in August just because the conditions were not there. And the load, exports, and wheeling priorities, even though it's a permanent feature, you may recall this has a sunset for the end of May 2022. And that is the main reason we have an ongoing initiative to see what's beyond that time frame. Next slide, please. And let me go straight into the performance of the month. Overall, you may recall that August was much milder than June and July. It was nothing close to what we observed in July. We have loads relatively coming in low levels. You may recall that indeed in the middle of August, there was a cool down period where loads came pretty low, sometimes even under $30,000 for the peak time. And that obviously helps. If you have less stressful conditions driven by weather, loads are coming lower. That just paves the way for having a quieter August, like what we saw this summer. Our peak for August was not even reaching the 43,000 megawatts. If you put in perspective August versus June or July, we actually saw higher demands in July. Indeed, the peak, what I believe is for the year now, depending where we are right now, I think was around September 8th or so, and it was just around 43,000 megawatts. And in here you have the trend for the last 3 months, June through August, and you can see the daily peak values in comparison to the monthly CC forecast. And we didn't hit that level of demand. And when you compare the demand, including the operating reserves, that amounts to the overall load needs that we have to meet, in comparison to the array showings, and this is just the monthly picture, you can see that we still came way below the monthly levels of the array. And this is just a good thing to see that we were with some slack here to manage conditions for the August month. Next slide, please. In terms of the specific features that we enable and put in place for this summer, given the conditions that we observed during August, some of them were not needed. For instance, we didn't have to issue any flex alerts. We did in early September, but not for August. We didn't have any emergencies or any declared EA warnings or alerts. And we didn't have to trigger scarcity pricing when we released the reserves at the penalty prices. We didn't have rocking feasibilities in the day-ahead market such that we didn't have to impose the minimum state of charge constraint for storage resources. And we didn't have the need to trigger or activate the reliability demand response conditions just because we didn't have that operational need. And because of that, relatively speaking, August was a quiet month. Next slide, please. The remainder of the deck effectively has the updated metrics that we have provided in the past, and I will just go through those. This one is the comparison of the day-ahead needs that accounts for the load forecast, the operating reserves, and for the dotted line, we can account also for the self-scheduled exports just to see effectively if we were to meet all that, what is the capacity, the supply that we would need to be able to have that balance. The shaded area in green and blue stands for the supply capacity that was coming into the day-ahead market. This is a closer view of the supply-demand condition that is slightly different but more accurate than the monthly showing that we have a couple of slides before. And you can see that just got depressed around August 21st, 22nd when we have very low levels. And in general, there was sufficient supply to be able to meet our load obligation. And that would be the main takeaway. I think if there are days to point out of August being more stressed, that would be early August, around August 4, 7, and at the end of August as well. And you will see in other metrics how that turned out to be when we talk about the exports or the level of curtailment that we may have. Next slide, please. This is a view of the net interchange, and this is based on HASP schedules for interties. The classical breakdown that we have on the import plus dynamics against the exports. and we account for the explicit wheels. And the trend in red stands for the net interchange. That is the algebraic difference of these components. And there are here two main trends to point out. The first one is that in early August, we saw relatively high level of exports altogether with low priority economics. All the exports were in general with a high volume. And that pushed the net interchange to become actually negative for the August 4th, similar to what we observed in July and maybe also in June. As you progress through the month, we can see that the level of exports reduced, and that is not surprising. They are largely influenced by weather conditions across the West. And in some levels, you can see around August 21st how small they were. They were pretty small in comparison to early August. On the other end, we have more imports coming into the system. And if you take a simple average of the imports or interchange across the peak hours, we can see that it was more robust in August in comparison to July. And that is a good thing to have simply because it means we have more supply available to meet the demand conditions in our system. Next slide, please. This is a similar breakdown that we have presented before regarding the components of the exports. And this becomes a little bit tricky because obviously we already have the policy of the load exports and wheels priorities in place starting on August 4th. And therefore you have these other breakdowns of day ahead, high priority, day ahead, low priority, real time, high priority, real time, low priority. These are just telling you whether they are originated from the day ahead or directly into the real time. We also have the components of the wheels. We also account explicitly for the existing transmission rights or TORs association. And there is something very interesting. And if you were able to glance through the report before the call, you might have realized that there are a few metrics that highlight a very marked change of trend. Something really happened for the second half of the month. And it's very precise. Around August 15, you can see that there is a very marked change. The export seems to come down. That is not surprising given the weather conditions. But in other metrics that are in the report, you can see that there is a very pronounced pattern change specific to the imports. And something may have happened in the West that now makes that volume to change so dramatically. When it comes to the breakdown of the export, we have a very standard profile for the month. And we can see that we have some volumes across the different groups. That's not surprising. And once we are dealing with exports in the range of 2,000-3,000 megawatts, I believe we're in a different range of expectations. There is no such a pressure in comparison to other levels when we have like early August, when we were reaching easily 8,000, 9,000 megawatts of overall exports. And this just highlights overall, again, the milder conditions that we observed through the month of August. Next slide, please. How stressed, how tight the conditions for August were. There are two methods that can give you a very easy view of that. One is how frequently, how severely rock was infeasible, meaning it has to relax the power balance constraint because there was not enough supply to meet all the requirements that we have, including potentially the operational adjustments that we do for the day ahead forecast. In the lower left, the trend is about the rock infeasibilities. Positive values mean undersupply. Negative value means oversupply. We did have oversupply conditions, and that is just when we have too little load or too much supply, either way. And again, that happens in the middle of the second half when we have very low levels of demand. And there are no positive values, meaning that there was no instances in August in which the market was infeasible to meet the supply with the demand. There are two lines in that trend. One is the metric against the standard load forecast that we use. The second one, that is the dotted, that is perfectly overimposing the other trend, is against the adjusted forecast. That is, if we account for the load forecast plus the operational adjustment, we may have also infeasibilities. And the infeasibility may show up first in that metric because we have higher requirements to meet. So in this case, there were no infeasibilities against either of the two references of the forecast. And that's just a signal that the tight supply conditions were not as prevalent in August like in previous months. That said, you look at the plot in the upper right, that is a trend of the exports that we have to reduce in the rock process. We did have several days in which we have to reduce exports. They were basically low priority and economic exports. The volumes are there. We were close to 2,400 megawatts around August 4th. And there were few days with those exports. And because they were enough to balance the system, that is the reason we didn't have the need to have an infeasibility in the rock process where the supply has to meet the demand. Next slide, please. Before I go into this other topic, because this is going to be a bit tricky to explain, let me pause, Isabella, and see if we have any questions.
All right.
As a reminder, if you use the Call Me feature on WebEx, you'll need to press the raise hand icon, which is located above the chat window. But if you called into the conference separately, you'll need to press #2.
All right, and I do see we have a caller in the queue. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, Guillermo. This is Alvis Svoboda at PG&E. I was just curious about, is my understanding correct that there was a procurement to a higher reserve margin this summer than in the previous summer?
Reserve margin.
RA procurement, was it to 17% or 17.5% rather than 15%?
Yes, and I don't think it was explicit as an additional requirement. I believe that was met somehow through some crediting. I will have to check with our RA guys. But yes, you're right. There was somehow an increase on the requirements, but I believe they were met more through the crediting. I will have to double check on that.
Okay, you're saying they were met through no actual change in procurement. So essentially just a difference in definition.
Yeah.
Okay. And when I looked at the slide you had of the RA margins, it looked to me like if the margin had been lower, you might well have seen 2 or 3 days where you were stressed. But if there wasn't actually incremental procurement, then I don't think that point would hold. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to make sure to check on that and get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, and I do not see any additional questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay, let's move on to this next topic, and I think this is going to be the trickiest part of the discussion for August, because unfortunately this area of the analysis was not very clean, and it's not very clean because we have a few issues in the implementation of the component of this summer enhancement. We have tried to do as much diligence as possible to try to portray an accurate picture, and I still believe we may have an opportunity to make it better. And we received some feedback from a participant, and I think that feedback is well appreciated, and we have been looking into that. And that is the reason you're going to see new information in this presentation that we're still assessing, And if eventually, I expect that we're going to revise the August report to be more precise on how we characterize and quantify the information. And let me try to walk you through this information. We have had will transactions before and after August 4th. And that is an activity that has and continues to happen. The change that we implemented back on August 4th has to do with the type of priority that we can associate to certain wills. Effective with the summary enhancement, there is a provision now that in order for a will transaction to get granted a high priority scheduling type, there needs to be a pre-registration process where they go through this registration and qualification, and once they get through, effectively they can utilize that in the market, and they will get assigned this high priority or PTK priority. If there are wills that are not going through the registration process, they can still come, and they may be assigned a low priority if they are willing to self-schedule. They may actually come with economic bids, and that's still allowed. The registration process is to ensure to get that higher priority for those wills. The information that you have here is the last 3 months, and there are basically two colors. The report has more information and more explanation on this. Prior to the implementation of August 4th, effectively all the will transactions that at that time they didn't need any registration process. By virtue of how the economics of the market work for two-leg transaction, the priority given to those transactions were super high because it's effectively the relative difference of the two penalty prices, and that would put them above any other scheduling priority. That is the main reason we classify those as high priority, because they would be above basically any other scheduling priority. Then, starting on August 4th, we would expect to have potentially two types, or even three types. One would be the high priority, the ones that were going through the registration process to get granted that level of priority. The low priority, meaning business as usual, they come into the market, they set a schedule, they don't have any registration, and they get this low priority. And potentially we may see indeed some economic wills. What the report contains so far is that for the whole month of August, we are using basically one color, that is the LPT, indicating that all the wills that came in were basically with an associated low priority type. I can tell you this metric as is reflective of what the market used. Effectively, the market for the whole month of August see all the wills through with low priority. And I think that is some of the precisions we have to clarify now in the report. This is reflective only of what the market effectively saw and effectuated based on the information received. The logic is more complicated because the reality is that in order for the will transaction to make it into the market, first it has to be pre-processed in the bid application, the cyber application. And that processing, that step is done based on two things. One, the logic that is defined in cyber, including now the logic of checking against the registration data, looking at, yes, if there is somebody claiming a high priority will, it has to match the source. The thing can be limited by the capacity that they register, and also by how the participant submits the information. And this is very resource specific. It has to match the resource defined. If somebody is submitting a will in the registration process that is will 111, and then they come and they submit a will that is 112, well, it's not going to recognize that it's the same will that we are dealing with. It has to match all the check and balances of the registration process. That is one subtle detail to consider. The other complication is that there is indeed some logic that we are currently assessing for which there is a delta between what the cyber application eventually assigns as a priority for that wheel versus the intended priority from the submission of the participant. The participant may have properly submitted all the fields and the information to get assigned this high priority status, and through the processing and mapping of that record, that priority was not eventually assigned properly, and that is an item that we're still assessing how and why that happened. So what I'm telling you is that there are basically three steps. One, what the market saw. Second, what the cyber application processed. And the first one, what the market intended, what the market participant intended to use and submit in the system. This metric, again, is only looking at the last leg of the process, what the market effectively used and act on in order to clear the schedules. And effectively, the market saw everything as low priority wheels. We have the typical metrics here indicating the paths, source to sink that were utilized in the month, the maximum volume. There are average volumes in the report that you can look at your pleasure. And this is, again, just a snapshot of what the market effectively used and cleared based on the information that the market receives. It happens that the information received into the market was not reflective of all the intended information that should have been processed in the upstream system. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is a variation of the same metrics. You can see that the values are going to be the same. The color code is slightly is the same, but the trend looks different now. And let me try to unpack this. On the left-hand side, what you have is the list of all the wheel transactions that were properly registered and processed for the month of August. These are by pair of source to sink and the registered quantity. If you sum up everything, we have about 1,021 megawatts of wheels registered to be high priority wheels. Effectively, they were going to be shown in the trend. They would be with the blue color because they are high priority. Because of the 2-3 issues that we have so far identified in the processing and mapping of these wheel transactions, what you have here now is a trend that is trying to estimate counterfactually what the tracking of the high priority wheels should have been coming from the upstream into the market. And you can just bounce between this slide and the previous one, Adam or Isabella, so just participants can see the delta. You can see here everything is low priority, and if you go now one forward, you can see that there is a breakdown between high priority and low priority. Because this metric is basically, we are effectively and manually estimating what the right picture should be if we discount the issues that prevented the registered high priority wheels to come properly through the systems into the market. And we can see first that one conclusion is that indeed some participants that requested high priority exports in the new process, they came properly through the system, but the system failed to give that right assignment of the priority. And we have counterfactually assessed that, and now it's shown in blue. There is still a portion in purple for low priority because that belongs to other wheels that may come for different source to sink combinations. They may also be for some wheels that came way above the value that they registered, and if that value is above what they registered, they are simply not high priority. So it's a combination of factors that resulted in this outcome. So the expectation for revising the monthly report is going to be basically in this direction. Once we complete the assessment of all the challenges that happen upstream for the assignment of the right priority, we're going to repost the August report. We're going to substitute that trend with this effectively one, showing the intended utilization of the registered wheels. I think the characterization has to be in the sense of, one, what the market actually used for the right or wrong reason, versus the second one, how these registered high priority wheels were intended to be used by participants. And in the conclusions that we put in the monthly report, given the fact that we didn't see any high priority in the market, we were not precise enough to indicate that that was not what the submission of the wheels was, but rather what the market processed. So we just need to make that now more accurate and reflective of what really happened behind in this dynamic. Once we complete this analysis, I believe we can complete that this week. We would revise the monthly report to clean this specific item. That said, I think one of the takeaways is that even with the counterfactual analysis and trending that we have done, you can see that the overall volume of the registered wheels was around 1,021 megawatts. Even if we assume that everything that came was still backed by high priority, that would still be below the amount of the registered wheels. So that still holds in the same direction to a less extent, but it still holds in the same direction of the current conclusions we have in the report. Let me see. Can we move to the next slide and see if we have still material on the. Okay. Let me pause to see if we have any questions or comments on the previous topic.
All right, and I do see we already have a question in the queue. Your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Guillermo. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just going back to the previous slide, slide 10. The question I had may be a bit theoretical for the market conditions that were there in August, but just for looking forward. When looking at the registered PTK wheels and the source and sink of those, how do we know which ones will impact Path 26 if in the future there's the binding constraint on that in the post-HAS process? Is it a distribution factor, or is it just a yes/no question between the source and sink pairs?
Yeah, I think the information is available for participants. The easiest way would be to take the shift factors applicable for the transmission constraint you want to analyze, the nomogram or any other transmission constraint that you identify, such as Path 26 or Path 15 or whatever internal constraint you want to analyze. And there will be an associated shift factor relative to the scheduling point of those transactions. For instance, there is a scheduling point associated with Malin, right? There will be a shift factor for that location. And effectively, you just take the algebraic difference between the source and the sink, effectively sink minus source. That will tell you the effectiveness or the flow impact that wheel is going to have on that specific constraint. The shift factors are made available through the market participant portal, so they should be available. And yes, there are shift factors applicable to the scheduling points. They are effectively 100% for the specific intertie, but they can vary in any range for a specific internal constraints, for any flow-based constraint.
Okay, that helps. I know we didn't have any of those happen in August, and not sure they did in September, but just a question for potentially for next year. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
All right, and I do not see any additional questions in the verbal queue at this time. Just a reminder to use the raise hand icon located in the top right-hand corner in the WebEx.
Okay, let's move on. The next topic is about the RA import. Similar to previous months, indeed, these trends are expanded to include the 3-month period. We already discussed and covered the months of June and July, and this just built up for the month of August. And in general, the trend of August is not that different to the previous 2 months. The vast majority of all the RA imports are coming to our market with bids at or below $0 per megawatt. That is somehow the expected outcome that we want to see given the rules that are applicable to the RA imports. The caveat for this metric is that it's only tracking the peak hours for weekdays. In the first report for June, we covered the full set, all hours, all days, and you can see that the trend is less than clear because obviously it accounts for all hours, including the weekends, and conditions change and bidding change. But these are the critical hours that we track to ensure we are aware of how the participation of the RA imports is playing so far. And overall, I think it's over 98, 99% of the volume of the RA imports coming at $0 or below $0. Next slide, please. Another trend we are looking closely is the fast addition of storage resources for 2021. And in the MPPF that we discussed back in June, I believe, we cover a 6-month period trend, and it's very fascinating to see the speed and the progression of the storage resources into the CAISO markets. Back in March, we were in the range of less than 1,000 megawatt hour of charge. As of now, we are exceeding the 5,000 megawatt hour of state of charge, and that is easily a 5-fold increase. When it comes to the charge and discharge, as shown in the upper left plot, we can see expected behavior, an expected outcome that works for maintaining the balance of the system, where storage resources are heavily discharged in the early hours of the day, and as we progress through the evening and the night peak is when they really start to be discharged, and that is effectively the ideal utilization of these resources, that they provide the additional supply when the system needs them the most. And this is just nice to see how it's working so far for these first months of the 2021. Next slide, please. Another area that we continue to track and is permanent now is the enhancement that was implemented for the capacity test. The enhancement is the addition of the uncertainty component that is utilized in the flexible ramping test now to be put into the capacity test. Effectively, having this extra added to the capacity test is going to increase the requirement, and an expectation is that at higher requirements, if things don't change in the same level, there may be potentially more failures, more frequency for failures. And indeed, that is what we have seen so far since the implementation of this enhancement back in June 16. For the month of August, effectively the addition of the uncertainty requirement to the capacity test has resulted in a 2-fold increase in the number of failures. Now, we could have seen about 108 failures. With the other included, the current outcome is in a frequency of failures in the range of 225, and that is effectively twice as much as without the other. And here you have the breakdown for every hour of the day, accrue for the month, for every single EIM entity, including the ISO. And the case effectively was impacted by having no failures with no other towards one failure by having the other. There are other entities that saw more dramatic increase in the number of failures. Next slide, please. This is the last component that we have been describing in previous reports, and this is just a laundry list that we have based on the analysis that we have done, the issues that we have identified. If you cross-check this list against the list that we have in the monthly performance report, you are going to see that this presentation has the last component added just because of the recent discussion we just have about the wheels. This is another item that we are tracking, and that is going to result in some revision to the monthly performance report specific to the wheel section. And you can see that the theme is, there is a common theme here, and the 4 items that we identify as issues that need or were fixed in August or even in September had to do precisely with the implementation of the last summer enhancements that is related to the scheduling priorities. And this month in particular has been very challenging to ensure that we can come with a clean, straight way to portray the trends, the metrics, because of all these 4 different issues conflating at the same time and creating just a very challenging space to be able to boil down what the accurate metrics should be. All of them are related to the management of the scheduling priorities. We have at least 3 items, the item 2, 3, and 4, impacted by a specific logic in the systems, either in the cyber application upstream or in the market application downstream. The number 4 may also have a complication by the nature of the mapping that we are doing between the registration of the wheels and how they are being mapped in the market application. The first item is not a software-specific issue, but it was impacted by the changes that we implemented. And the short story is that prior to the enhancements that we implemented on August 4th, we have a specific, well-defined set of parameters utilized in the market application to define every single penalty price. When the changes were implemented on August 4th, we assessed, we validated, we tested all the changes using these existing parameters. The problem arose by the fact that with the summer enhancements, in addition to those existing parameters, there was a new set of parameters created that should have carried the same priority of the all existing ones, and they did not. And effectively, the market started utilizing the new parameters rather than the existing ones, and that was part of the problem. For the month of August and all the way through September 18, when we effectively implemented the correction, the assignment of priorities for low priority exports and mainly for low priority exports was not correct. And we are doing further assessment to see the implications of those. Now, given that perspective, I think it's important to identify one component here. These issues became of material impact when we are in a condition of reducing exports, relaxing the power balance constraint. As long as we are not in that condition, whether the penalty prices were right or not have very little material implication because they are not utilized. It's only when the relaxation of the constraints have to happen, it's only when the scales have to be cut that these parameters becomes of relevance. If there are no cuts, there is no priority implications whether one should be cut before the other. So given the fact that we didn't have to reduce to be power balancing feasible for the month of August, many of these issues were not material. Given the fact that we have to cut some exports in mainly the first half of August, and they were only economic or low priority exports, the material impact was not there even for those, because even if we have to still cut exports, they would have been cut first because they are low priority. What I'm indicating is that, yes, we are recognizing that these were issues that were not meeting the expectation of the implementation. When it comes to practical terms, all of them at this point have not had any material impact as of what we have assessed so far. Even the last issue that we are describing here for the wheel transactions, there were no wheel transactions cut in the market. And because of that, the fact that they didn't get the high priority or the low priority is a moot point. There was no material implications by having them with low priority when ideally they should have been assigned a high priority. That is a part of the assessment that we are doing as part of our internal process to assess any material impact on those. There is one item that did have a material implication for some resources. We assessed the month of August, and I think there were about 10 or 12 instances, resource/hours, in which, because of this misalignment of the priorities, under very specific conditions, these 10, 12 hours, there were a few records in which the real-time application, the HASP process, the hourly ahead scheduling process, that is the last opportunity to clear interties, created these duplicates of records for the same export having two different types of priorities. And effectively, when the market saw that, it cleared the two records concurrently. What the participant may have seen is effectively that they got an award for twice as much what they bid in. And we are addressing this through the standard dispute process. And that would be so far the material implication that we have identified for these specific issues. And again, we are still going through the discovery process of the last item that impacted the assignment of the high priority wheels. So by tomorrow or Friday, you may see a correction to the August report to reflect more precisely the volume of high priority exports that were registered and that they indeed came into the market. That's all what I have for this presentation. I think the 30,000 feet picture here is that, relatively speaking, August was a quiet month in comparison to July and June. I think there is more interesting things to discuss for the month of September when we actually peak, and that is coming in the next couple of weeks. And with that, we would be winding down the effort of the summer readiness when it comes to the market performance. Let me pause and see if there are any pending questions.
Not see any questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay, Isabella, that's all what we have for today. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Guillermo. Since there are no further questions, that concludes today's web conference. Thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your day.